The White House podium had barely cooled from Donald Trump's announcement when the first cracks began to show. The demand had been absolute, delivered not as diplomacy but as decree. $350 billion worth of Canadian uranium, a 25-year supply locked in at 12% below market rates, enforced by the implicit threat of secondary sanctions against any nation that dared buy what America wanted first. This was not a negotiation. This was Washington treating a sovereign ally like a colonial fuel depot. The problem, as the world would learn within hours, was that the fuel depot had already shipped its inventory. Mark Carney did not storm out of a room. He did not summon cameras for a theatrical denunciation. He walked to a simple podium in Ottawa, alone, without flags draped for effect, and spoke in the quiet tone of a man delivering routine accounting. Canada has received the American proposal regarding uranium supply. We have reviewed the terms carefully, and we must inform the United States that the proposal cannot be fulfilled. Not because Canada refuses, but because the uranium the United States is requesting is no longer available for purchase. That pause before no longer lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In diplomatic terms, it was an epic. Carney then revealed what had been happening in plain sight for 6 months while Washington was busy declaring trade wars and counting tariff revenues. Canada had signed long-term uranium contracts with France, Japan, South Korea, India, the United Kingdom, and the European Atomic Energy Community. Not tentative memorandums, not letters of intent. Binding, finished, fuel-in-the-pipeline agreements that committed virtually every available ton of Canadian uranium export capacity for the next 15 to 20 years. The buyers had paid market price. They had negotiated respectfully. Not once had a threat accompanied a purchase order. Then came the line that will be dissected in strategy seminars for decades. Carney looked directly into the camera, not at the journalists, not at the room, but straight into the lens, aiming at the White House, and said with no change in tone, "You're not early. You're not late. You're irrelevant." The word irrelevant landed like a blade across the entire architecture of American power projection. Nations refuse demands. They reject proposals. They counteroffer. They stall. They do not tell the United States of America that its most urgent strategic request is not worth the time it took to utter. But Carney did because the math was already finished. By the time Trump stood at that podium, the uranium had been sold. The contracts had been notarized, and the shipping manifests were being printed in languages that were not English. To understand why this moment represents not a diplomatic setback, but a national security emergency, you have to grasp a fact that most Americans have never been told. The United States operates 93 commercial nuclear reactors, generating roughly 20% of the nation's electricity. It maintains the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth and a naval fleet of submarines and aircraft carriers that depend on weapons-grade uranium. And yet, America imports 93% of its uranium. Domestic production has been declining for 30 years. The mines that remain are low-grade, aging, and buried under a regulatory regime that makes new development a decade-long ordeal. The single largest foreign source of that uranium is Canada, specifically the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, home to the highest-grade uranium deposits on the planet. Without that supply, the reactors do not throttle back. They shut down. Nuclear fuel is not oil. You cannot switch to natural gas. You cannot spin up renewables overnight. A reactor runs on enriched uranium, and when the fuel runs out, the megawatts vanish from the grid. Today, American reactors hold between 18 and 24 months of fuel in their cores and on-site storage. That is the buffer. After that, every reactor in the country begins competing for a global uranium supply that just became vastly more expensive and constrained, because the largest, most reliable, most geopolitically stable source of that fuel is now contractually committed to other nations for the next 2 decades. The Pentagon convened emergency reviews within 72 hours. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission sent guidance to reactor operators asking for contingency plans in the 18 to 36-month window. A classified assessment leaked to the Washington Post reportedly described the Canadian uranium redirection as the most significant threat to American nuclear fuel security since the end of the Cold War, and recommended immediate emergency procurement from Kazakhstan and Australia at whatever price the market demanded. The cost of that emergency procurement was estimated at $4 to $6 billion above what the same uranium would have cost under normal Canadian supply arrangements. A premium paid entirely because Washington had turned its closest, cheapest, most reliable fuel partner into an adversary. The spot price of uranium jumped 14% within a week of Trump's original demand. Within 2 weeks, futures had spiked 22%, the largest sustained increase since the Fukushima disaster in 2011. American nuclear utility stocks dropped an average of 11% as investors repriced fuel costs and operational risk. And Cameco, the Canadian uranium giant that would have been the primary supplier under Trump's proposed agreement, saw its stock rise 19% because its long-term contracts with Europe and Asia guaranteed revenue at market rates regardless of what happened with the United States. The market was sending an unambiguous signal. Canada had won, America had lost, and the price of losing would be paid by American ratepayers and American national security. Warren Buffett, watching from Omaha, called it the most sophisticated strategic operation he had witnessed from any government leader in his lifetime. He did not mean the refusal. He meant the 18 months that led to it. In 70 years of business, I have learned that the outcome of a negotiation is almost never determined at the negotiating table. It is determined by what each side did before they sat down. The person who prepared, who secured alternatives, who removed dependencies, who positioned themselves so that walking away is costless and staying is optional, that person wins. The person who shows up needing a deal, who has no alternatives, who cannot walk away, that person loses. It doesn't matter how loud they are. It doesn't matter how many threats they make. If you need the deal more than the other side needs to give it to you, you have lost before you open your mouth. Buffett then drew the line directly to Carney. What Carney did is the most elegant example I have ever seen of a concept every business student learns in week 1 and every CEO forgets by year 5. The best negotiators don't win at the table. They win before they sit down. Carney spent 18 months absorbing tariffs, absorbing sanctions, absorbing demands, absorbing the full economic weight of the most powerful nation on earth, quietly signing the contracts that would make America's demands irrelevant. He let America exhaust itself throwing punches while he was building a house somewhere else. And when America finally came to demand the thing it needed most, the uranium, the nuclear fuel, the one commodity with no substitute and no workaround, the house was built, the tenants had moved in, and there was no room left. Consider the sequence. The energy suspension that plunged American border states into emergency was not just about oil and gas. It was a signal to the world that Canada was willing to weaponize its resources, catching the attention of every nation quietly worried about its own nuclear fuel security. The critical mineral export freeze was not just retaliation. It was a test run for restricting a strategic commodity, proving that Canada could execute a targeted suspension cleanly, without domestic economic collapse, and with legal infrastructure to sustain it. The port refusal was not just about sovereignty over shipping. It was the physical redirection of trade routes toward the ports through which uranium would later flow. The trade agreements signed with the European Union, Japan, India, and South Korea were not just about replacing American consumer goods. They were building the diplomatic relationships and commercial infrastructure through which uranium contracts would be executed. Even the jokes, the Bordeaux moment, the moments of public humor that humiliated the White House on the world stage, served a strategic function, cementing personal relationships with allied leaders whose governments would later sign those binding uranium agreements. Every move was a setup. Every retaliation was a positioning operation. Every confrontation that looked reactive was actually preparatory. Carney was not responding to Trump for 18 months. He was building a chessboard, placing pieces, engineering a position in which, when the uranium demand finally arrived, the answer was already determined, the contracts were already signed, and the refusal was not a decision but a mathematical inevitability. The domestic political fallout cut across every line that usually divides Washington. Republican defense hawks who had supported every previous escalation against Canada broke with the White House over uranium, because the naval nuclear propulsion program and the strategic deterrent depend directly on that fuel supply. One Republican senator, a member of the Armed Services Committee, said in a floor speech, "I have supported this president's approach to Canada at every turn. I supported the tariffs. I supported the trade pressure. I supported every measure this administration took to renegotiate the relationship. But I cannot support a policy that jeopardizes the fuel supply for our nuclear submarines and our strategic deterrent. That is a red line, and this White House just crossed it." A Democratic senator on the Energy Committee added, "We are looking at a scenario where American nuclear reactors begin experiencing fuel supply uncertainty within 3 years because we tried to bully our closest ally into giving us a discount on uranium. That is not tough negotiation. That is strategic malpractice." The governors of 11 states most dependent on nuclear power, states where nuclear generates more than 30% of electricity, sent a joint letter to the White House demanding immediate action to restore uranium supply security. The letter was signed by governors of both parties and included a projection showing that electricity rates in nuclear-dependent states could increase 15 to 25% within 3 years if alternative uranium procurement at elevated global prices became the new baseline. Illinois, which operates 11 reactors generating half the state's power, Pennsylvania with 9, South Carolina with 7, all staring at a fuel cliff. Energy company CEOs who had remained neutral throughout the broader US-Canada confrontation abandoned that neutrality entirely. The CEO of one of the nation's largest nuclear utilities said at an industry conference, "We have been warning this administration for months that the Canadian relationship is not just about trade. It is about the fuel that keeps our reactors running and the lights on for 50 million Americans." Nobody listened. And now the fuel we need is under contract to France and Japan, and we are scrambling to find alternatives at prices that will be passed directly to every household and every business in our service territory. The international reaction carried a frequency of alarm that previous confrontations had not triggered, because uranium activates defense ministries and intelligence agencies in a way that copper and oil do not. France's nuclear authority confirmed its supply contract within an hour of Carney's statement, adding a phrase that diplomatic observers flagged as pointed: a significant enhancement of European energy security. Japan's chief cabinet secretary confirmed the Japanese consortium agreement and added a sentence that was a stiletto aimed directly at Washington. Japan is grateful for Canada's commitment to providing reliable uranium supply to partners who value the relationship. The United Kingdom, South Korea, and India issued similar confirmations throughout that same day, each one another door closing. And here is the paradox that transforms this from a diplomatic defeat into a strategic catastrophe. The demand itself was the final proof that the United States had no alternatives. You only demand what you desperately need. You only demand publicly when you have failed to secure it privately. You only demand with threats when you have nothing else to offer. The White House's uranium demand broadcast to the entire world, to every uranium-producing nation, every nuclear fuel broker, every enrichment facility on Earth, that the United States was desperate for nuclear fuel and had no backup plan. Kazakhstan, the world's largest uranium producer, raised its spot pricing to American buyers by 8% within 48 hours of Trump's announcement, because the demand told Kazakhstan exactly how much leverage it had just acquired. Australia's uranium producers signaled similar adjustments. The demand did not fail to secure uranium. It made every other source of uranium on Earth more expensive for the United States. So, where does this leave the 93 American reactors, the nuclear submarine fleet, the carrier strike groups, and the strategic deterrent? The existing fuel reserves provide an 18 to 24-month window. That window is real, but it is not a solution. It is a countdown. Every month that passes without securing alternative long-term supply from Kazakhstan, Australia, or other producers tightens the market and raises the price. The Pentagon's emergency procurement recommendations would cost billions above normal market rates, and those billions will ultimately flow to ratepayers, taxpayers, or both. The Canadian supply is gone for 15 to 20 years. The contracts are signed. The shipments are scheduled. Carney did not bluff. He built. Buffett's closing observation was devastating in its simplicity. Brawlers win fights. Chess players win wars. Trump has been brawling with Canada for 18 months. Tariffs, sanctions, demands, threats, press conferences, social media attacks. He won some of those fights. He imposed real costs. He caused real pain. And while he was brawling, Carney was playing chess. And the chessboard was the global uranium market. And now the game is over. And the brawler is standing in the ring looking for his opponent. And the chess player is at home reading the contracts he signed 6 months ago, knowing that the brawler just discovered what checkmate feels like. The brawler never saw the board. He was too busy throwing punches. The United States demanded Canada's uranium. Carney had already sold it. The White House tried to force compliance through threats and secondary sanctions. Carney had already made compliance impossible through contracts and partnerships signed in quiet rooms with respectful partners at fair prices, with handshakes instead of threats. And when the most powerful nation on Earth made its most urgent strategic demand, the response was not a refusal, not a counteroffer, not a diplomatic deflection. It was 9 words that reduced that demand to an afterthought. You're not early. You're not late. You're irrelevant. The most dangerous opponent is never the one who fights you. It is the one who lets you fight while quietly removing every option you will need when the fight is over. By the time Trump demanded the uranium, the room was already empty. The fuel was already gone. And the clock on American nuclear security was already running. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.